Jolai wa hoi wa don da kire wita. Linde we ach no. Wakonda monchizaski wakonda utseda tatsi topa wakonda gi. We watsi witikwe. I greet you all with respect and call upon the energies from above and below and from the four directions to come and be with me as I speak. What a great conference this has been. You all are to be congratulated for doing this in a Zoom scenario. I'd much rather be in Haudenosaunee territory right now, of course, but of course, this pandemic and the national leadership under this pandemic has made that nearly impossible. The national leadership, their national leadership, not Haudenosaunee or Osage. Bindi Wishaji Tsele, I'm Osage Nation, and I come to you from Denver, Colorado, where I live. We've heard a lot. We've learned a great deal over these 3 sessions. And I'm especially grateful for the voices of those Haudenosaunee elders that we've heard. What a great role model for us as an Indigenous way of being and speaking, and how precious that is for the younger generation. On this business of immigration, 2 things. One, we've got to remember that all those illegal immigrants coming up from the South are Indians who've never recognized that border, and nor have we. So they're our close relatives who are being caged and who are having their children separated from them at the border. But I also remember an Indian gentleman 35 years ago who wrote to the then President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, cautioning him to make sure he had a really good immigration policy. He said, we Indians didn't. And you can see what happened. For a number of years, I worked from after 1992, after the Columbian Quincentenary. I began working with denominational groups, encouraging them to renounce the doctrine of discovery. Little by little, all major denominations seem to have fallen into line to renounce it. The doctrine of, let's be Steve Newcomb for a minute, the doctrine of Christian discovery, right? Except for one. The one church that hasn't is the church that coined it, the church that created it, the Roman Catholic Church. And probably it's not going to change until the Catholics decide to step into the fray and admit that that papal bull began what is an international crime, as Tupac has reminded us, a crime against humanity, the crime of colonialism. But since those denominations have renounced discovery, I've had a chance to go back to several of them in small groups and large groups and ask them, okay, you renounced discovery. Aren't you wonderful? What happened? Was that something that affected Indian people? For instance, when you renounced discovery, how much land did Indian people get back? Or was this just an internal dialogue you all had to make you all selves feel better about living on Indian land? You renounced discovery. Can we keep your land now? Surely it means something more than that. Surely we've got to continue to fight this battle. It's not enough just to renounce discovery. when it's the civil law of this continent, especially since Johnson v. McIntosh in 1823, but it was the law of the land even before that. Even before the United States came into being, this so-called great president, Thomas Jefferson, who was the principal culprit in stealing my land. Actually, he purchased my land from the French. We Osages are still trying to figure that one out. You know, how could he buy our land from someone else? You know, a third party who claimed to have the right to sell it. What Jefferson actually bought from France was the right of discovery. But Jefferson, before the United States was formed, served as a lawyer in Virginia in 400 property cases where discovery was being invoked, even though Marshall's term doctrine of discovery had not yet been created. So it was already the law of the land. And I think we've got to make sure that we're clear about one thing in particular in terms of Johnson v. McIntosh. John Marshall was clear that the righteousness of the Euro-Christian invaders in killing Indians and stealing Indian land was their Christian religion and the superiority of Christianity itself. Never forget that. Even those Indians who have adopted Christianity need to remember that righteousness is what enabled the Euro-Christians to steal our lands, kill our ancestors, take our grandparents into boarding schools, deprive them of their language, and to begin the process of eroding and erasing American Indian cultures in one reservation after another. Make no mistake about it. Faith in Jesus Christ made it quite all right to kill Indians and steal their land. Just saying. Where do we go from here? Well, Brown v. McIntosh overturned the law that separated blacks and whites in the South, right? They got lawyers to go into the Supreme Court and overturn the prior law. It's interesting that Johnson v. McIntosh has never been overturned. There's never been much public discussion about overturning it. So I'm speaking now to all of our allies out there who have been a part of renouncing the doctrine of Christian discovery. Maybe your next job is to overturn your own law in Johnson v. McIntosh. Of course, that raises all kinds of other questions, doesn't it? Like, where are you going to live? Because Johnson v. McIntosh is the foundational law for all property ownership in North America. So your property title becomes null and void once Johnson v. McIntosh is overturned. But yet it's the right thing to do. It's the moral thing to do. So what's stopping you other than personal self-interest, white privilege, and white privilege invested in property? And that goes whether you're own a home or are renting a home. If you're renting an apartment, it's still on Indian land. I want to take you back to 1980 when a friend of mine gave a speech. was published in Mother Jones in the September issue in 1980. The title of Russell Means' essay was "For the World to Live, Europe Must Die." For the world to live, Europe must die. Now, let's unpack that a little bit, because I think that's as pertinent today as it was back when Russ gave that speech 40 years ago. By Europe, he means to include the United States, right? I mean, the United States is an extension of Europe. It's a colony of Europe. It's Europe colonization of Indian lands. So when he says Europe must die, he's talking about not the United States government, not the European Union, not the government of England or the government of Germany or the government of France. He's talking about that philosophical substance that creates the identity that we think of as European, of I call it Euro-Christian culture. That's what's got to die. You see, in Johnson v. McIntosh, all of a sudden, our land, the earth itself, was converted in one legal Christian religious civil law into property. It quit being our grandmother at that moment in the mind of Europeans, and it became a resource that was to be split up and owned. And again, long before Johnson v. McIntosh, George Washington was speculating in Indian land in the Ohio Valley, that is in the Western Iroquois League territory in their lands. And when he died, he still owned 49,000 very profitable acres of Indian land. And of course, I've just named two presidents whose faces are carved into that sacred Lakota mountain that now gets called, what's the name of it? Mount Mushmore? I'm sorry, it's Rushmore, right? Rushmore. But it seems like mush to Indian people up in South Dakota, I'll tell you. Now, how do we get people to wrap their minds around getting Europe out of action and replacing Euro-Christian culture with a whole different worldview? See, we can do that for ourselves, but this isn't a personal, individual action that we're talking about. Somehow we have to convince the military-industrial complex, which includes people like Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, Democrats and Republicans both, and those who are really excited about, all of a sudden, about Joe Biden's campaign. You need to realize that's still Europe. Yeah, we've got probably to vote that way just to get rid of what we got. I understand that reality too, but let's not think that's the salvation of the world. Certainly not. In fact, Hillary Clinton would have signed off on the Dakota Access Pipeline nearly as fast as Donald Trump did. So that wouldn't have helped Indian people. And of course, when it comes to doctrine of discovery, Haudenosaunee people certainly know that it was a liberal Democrat on the Supreme Court that wrote the the majority opinion in a court case only 15 years ago that cited the doctrine of discovery, that cited Johnson v. McIntosh as the reason for turning down the appeal of the Oneida Nation in terms of their lands in New York. See, we got a long ways to go if we're going to convince people like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, if we're going to communicate with the European political processes in the US Congress. The problem is that we're talking about two wholly different worldviews. The worldview of our Indian people tends to be egalitarian. I call it collateral egalitarian. Or as my colleague and friend, Shawnee friend here in Denver, professor of political science, says, there are no bosses in the Indian world because we're all the same. Yeah, we pay attention to our elders. That's respect. That's wahoy. Jole wahoy, with respect. But then we're raised from the time we're young to show respect for all our relatives. That is, to show respect for a tree that's right outside my window here. The plants that are outside of your home. The grasses, the mountains, the rivers, the water. This stuff right here. We no longer can treat it as a resource, but have to understand all those people as relatives, close relatives, who will help provide for us if we will just respond with respect to them. Yet in that European worldview, which is an up-down hierarchy, there's always a king or a president or a governor or a CEO of a business or a bishop of a church or a priest or a pastor in a church who lords it over the others. Whereas the one that white people call chief among the Osages, people say, but you all had chiefs. We did better than most. We had two chiefs in every Osage village, one with the Earth people and one with the South people. And they took turns every other day being in charge, kind of like having Donald Trump on Mondays and Hillary Clinton on Tuesdays. And of course, my white interlocutors can't wrap their minds quite around that, so they laugh and catch it as a piece of humor. But our chiefs never had that kind of autocratic, up-down, hierarchical power. Their job was simply to reflect back the consensus of the people. That's where we need to go. How do we convince the military-industrial complex to give up its power? How do we convince them to stop using that European metaphor of the cosmic struggle of good versus evil in their foreign policy? What the United States wants, they go for by framing the opponent as evil, whether it's communism or more today, Islam or non-formal states. That's the work we have ahead of us. It's really, really going to take a lot of concerted effort, a lot more conversations like this one in order for us to get on the same page And I'm afraid it's going to take our allies a lot of hard work. But let's face it, even Indian people have been colonized. When I did a PhD, it took me the next 40 years of my life to work on the project of decolonizing my mind, because I had to work in their discourses, in their language, in order to get the PhD, in order to get the job teaching in a school of higher education, and then in order to be able to explain to my colleagues why I didn't argue formally exactly the way they did, and why I saw the world so very differently. Even at that, it took me a long time to finally decide we couldn't use a simple everyday word like prayer anymore in the Indian world, because prayer is an up-down image scheme. It's a hierarchy. You're praying to someone who's above. Whereas for Indian people, the Wanagi are on the same plane as us. They just are in a different world and come to us, so that the word the missionaries picked for us to mean prayer, Osages, was wada. And Osages today think wada means prayer, when in actuality it only means to talk, an everyday activity. So when we do ceremony at Four Winds here in Denver, where I served for 25 years as a volunteer leader, we wada, we talk to the Wanagi once we have brought them in to the ceremony to be with us. That's just one piece of decolonization, one word. And now, in order to reclaim our languages, we've got to pare back the English that's been attached to our languages bit by bit. And we've got to somehow convince Indian lawyers, who've also gone through that colonization process in a law program, in a law school. We've got to convince them to reassess what federal Indian law is and get them to understand federal Indian law isn't Indian. And even though they're earning a living doing federal Indian law, maybe they need to begin to reassess how they approach federal Indian law, instead of approaching it as a given that they have to deal with. So there's plenty for all of us to do, for Indians and our allies, in this process of decolonizing our minds and decolonizing the doctrine of Christian discovery. Good to be with you all.